Hi, this is a song I made earlier this April. I was posting update snippets while working on the song, and I was really excited to see all the positive feedback. One person even asked me to do a tutorial, so here it is. That being said, here's how I made it. Now, before I begin, many high-tech tutorials I've seen do a fantastic job at covering the main body of the drop, but I haven't seen much on how to develop it or turn it into a full song, so I'll be breaking down my project file into distinct chapters that cover these things. Starting with the intro. The way I like to approach my intros is to try and set the stage for what is to come. I like to do this by hinting at various elements in the song, such as melodic or rhythmic themes. The song starts off with a zero-release piano, since I love its versatility and its sound, plus it's common in the genre. When writing the chord progression for this song, the first thing I did is placing this 9th chord to begin building from. Now, you might be wondering, what does 9th even mean? And that's a great question. Essentially, what we're doing is making a normal chord and adding 2 notes to it, which are the 7th and the 9th. The terminology can be quite confusing, but all we are doing is continuing this alternating pattern of 2 and 3. I'm not very good at explaining these things, so I left some helpful resources in the description. From there, I like to try and feel out a bass line until I land on something that sounds right. While it is hard for me to explain my process since it is mostly intuition, the 2 best tips I can provide are 1, hum it out and do whatever feels most natural, and from there, it's mostly just trial and error. From there, I fill out the rest of the progression using various chord extensions. A large part of my personal process is filling in notes that sound pleasant in an arpeggiating pattern, as well as a lot of trial and error. And then lastly, I try to chop it up a bunch to make it more interesting and thematically consistent with the high-tech genre. There is no right or wrong way to do this, so long as there is a discernible pattern. Just try to play by ear and see what sticks. For the piano layers themselves, I have a harsh piano layer to saturate and occupy the mid and high frequencies, a light, plucky sort of key sound to add a nice transient as well as some interesting harmonics, the main zero-release piano that sets the main character of the sound, and lastly, a square wave that fills in the cracks and gives the whole sound a nice body. It then sweeps into the second part of the intro, where the song develops a little. The goal here is to build upon the melody and give it a sense of rhythm and direction by introducing more elements and filling out the spectrum. The first step I took in filling out the intro is filling out the drums. From there, I begin to hear and come up with ideas for what to add. For these drums, I start with the main drum loop for the section, a small crash that's layered with the kick, an extra top loop that fills in additional space, and reverse kicks before every other kick, all of which get bit crushed as it transitions into the next section. When making the body of the intro, I began by structuring it around the following elements: chords, leads, and pads. Using the chord progression from the intro, we have the zero-release piano, which is accompanied by a sub. I also have a chord stack that plays on each beat with a tape stop for extra flair. From there, I continue our call and response pattern with the set of leads and support basses. The first lead is our zero-release piano from earlier, which is followed by the Sega Genesis lead. For the basses, I have this guitar which contrasts with the sub, as well as the Sega Genesis bass for additional detail. And last here, we have the atmospheric stuff. First is this pad that I found and MIDI-mapped through PitchMap and processed, which has this really wide sound, as well as these sparkly harmonics that I really like. There's also this really wide and puffy sounding arp that I made that gives the whole sound a nice texture. Moving to our final layers, we round out the sound by filling in any cracks and polishing with some extra detail using textures and effects. First, I have this disco string that serves as a frequency filler for a specific space and key, this weird plucky guitar loop to add some interesting texture to the sound, this pair of weird and glitchy frequency filler sounds with interesting transients, a little string stab for extra flair, and a bunch of various impacts and crashes and risers to sweep up or down depending on the section of the song. All of which sounds like this. With the intro out of the way, our next step would be to find a way to transition into the next section, which is where I put a bridge. The goal is to build off each element that we've established by progressing the melody somewhere between the intro and the drop, as well as creating some tension by pulling back or introducing various elements. Keeping the same texture and effects layers, I start by cutting out the intro-specific patterns. In order to build tension, I have a low-pass filter on all the melodic elements in this section, in addition to hinting the melody of the drop. I'm using the same chords from the intro, but without the additional chopping and detail. For the elements themselves, I have these plucky chords playing 16th notes, a pulse wave lead as well as the Toho sound font church bell, and lastly, a pair of chords using the Sega Genesis sound font as well as a sub. And altogether, it sounds like this. Carrying onto the second bridge later in the song, I apply the same concepts of both tension and movement, with the addition of elements from the drop. Now that we've established our bridges, we can now explore the build-ups in this track, which takes us to our next chapter. The goal is to take the tension that we've created and build up energy that delivers us to an impactful and satisfying drop. One way I like to do this is by pulling the listener in through a few subtle master effects that contrast with the drop. For example, subtle narrowing of the stereo field, slightly reducing the low end, and lightly decreasing the audio levels, all of which kind of funnels the listener into the drop. As for the elements themselves, I kept all the same layers from the bridge, but with some additional changes. First, I reintroduced the choppy chords from the intro, faded the bridge plucks out, layered additional leads using the zero release piano and the Sega Genesis sound font from earlier, as well as a chord stack from the drop on each beat. And then, most importantly, the build-up drums, which consists of the main build-up loop, the garage loop from earlier for additional percussion, kicks layered with small cymbal crashes, as well as assorted reverse kicks, all of which sounds like this. The second build-up is mostly the same, just with some additional influence from the first drop. With that done, we can now move on to the fun part, which is constructing the drop. Since this is arguably the most important part of the song, I want to preface that there are some heavy considerations to be mindful of that I will outline. When putting the drop together, we should always be critically listening. This means listening for specific attributes, like pitch for example. With elements that sound similar, if they seem to be fighting for space, try experimenting with different octaves. Same goes for dynamics. If you want to try and make it more exciting, try experimenting with velocities or levels on your audio clips. Or timbre, if you're aiming for a different sort of tone, try messing with EQ and distortion and see where that goes. Or for articulation, if you want to try and breathe additional life into a melody or progression, try adjusting the length of various notes and see what sticks. And lastly, levels of activity. This becomes a balancing act of determining whether the song is missing additional layers, is too cluttered, or if it's simply a matter of mixing. All of which is subjective, but aids in the creative process. With that being said, here's how I put the drop together. Starting with the drums, I have a main drum loop to begin building around. To make it more interesting, I layer it with this ticking percussion loop, a phasey sort of hat loop, some wide hats, and some frequency filler hats. Then to top it all off, I also have these pews which are common in the sound. One thing to note, the way I personally do my drums leaves a lot to be desired, so do whatever works best for you. This is just how I did them. Moving on to the bass, I like to alternate between different basses throughout the pattern to have some variety in the texture and sound. First, I have the main saw bass, which is popular in the genre. I hand it off with the supplementary bass that I also use in every one of my songs. Any two main bass sounds can work as long as they contrast nicely but still share the same characteristics. I also have this little blip kind of bass that pops in every now and then to prevent the two basses from getting stale. For the bassy chops, I'm using a ton of various bass samples and bass loops pulled from these sample packs and splicing them around. I don't have a precise method for arranging these specifically, it's primarily intuition plus trial and error. That being said, here's how the bass sounds. For the melodic chops, I'm pulling from a bunch of various melody, vocal, and bass loops from these sample packs. What I do is cut out the low end and try to splice them all together in a way that makes sense. There's a lot of skill expression in chopping and splicing since there is no right or wrong way to do it. The goal is just to communicate some sort of discernible rhythm to the listener. What works for me is trying to leverage the chops to try and accentuate the rhythm of the bass. Here's how those sound. And lastly, the melody section. All this is doing is accentuating the chops and transitioning between phrases. There are a couple various chord stabs that I layered with the chord hits from the chop section to make it pop more. At the end of each bar, I have this chord fill that has a chord stack, some supporting blippy sounds, and the main leads. Underneath all of this is a wide and puffy arp that fills in extra space. The B section of the drop is the same as before, but with the following changes. First, I removed the extra bass chops and reduced it down to just the 2 alternating basses with the occasional blips for variety. Then, I cut the choppy samples out entirely and replaced them with my own chord progression. Pulling inspiration from the choppy intro chords, I'm doing the same thing here, switching between the chord stack and zero release piano to create a call and response. To add more detail and make it more interesting, I'm also modulating the call and response with a low pass filter and an LFO, which sounds like this. All of these changes made with the intention of shifting focus to the lead solo, which uses the same leads from the intro in addition to the Sans lead, as well as my personal lead that I use in every single song. One thing I like to do with my leads is to include some sort of counter melody. I find that it makes the overall sound feel more rich and full and adds a degree of complexity to the sound that I really enjoy. One way I do this is by going through and manually adjusting a second layer with the same pattern, but moving each note up a couple steps relative to the initial key. From there, it's just trial and error until I'm happy with the sound. This is how it sounds before and after. And altogether, this is how it sounds. One last thing I want to cover before moving on to the next chapter is the mixing. This is not exclusive to the drop, but I felt that now is a good time to explain my fundamental process since it is very simple. Okay, so we have 3 focuses for a mix: the primary level of focus, the secondary level of focus, and the tertiary level of focus. Anything below this should be very subtle elements that are felt and not heard. What we do is once we have a general composition, we ask ourselves, what do I want the main focus to be? And go from there, creating a hierarchy of focus in the sounds. Almost like a tier list. The way we tweak a sound's properties to achieve this hierarchy of sound is almost always achieved by just the following: compression to boost presence and make it more dynamically consistent, balance to change the volume relative to other elements, reverb to impose a space in the sound, delay to add variety and occupy additional space, EQ to polish or change a sound, and panning to create space and depth between elements. Also, make sure to utilize stereo with knobs. They will allow you to expand or narrow down various sounds in your mix, and they will go a long way in bringing your mixes to life. And with that, we can move on to our final chapter, which is the breakdown. The goal here is to provide a sort of landing pad for the end of the drop, as well as to segue into the following section. While there are plenty of ways to achieve this, this is how I did it. The end of the section has a break that builds tension before transitioning to the next part that I shamelessly stole from this Syntheon stream that consists of 3 main parts: melodic stabs, drum hits, and effect sweeps. The melodic stabs consist of a variety of layers, which are the following: the zero release piano, the chord stack, the Toho bell, and some staccato strings, all of which fall under the call section. The response simply consists of the piano, which stands by itself. The drum hits are also playing on the same 16th notes as the chords, with a layered kick and crash. And lastly, the effects, which fade up on the response of the piano. And here's how that final part sounds. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I worked really hard on this video to make it as good as I could and plan to do more. So if you liked the video, please consider subscribing and I'll see you in the next one.